Yeah. So okay, I guess my question about magical realism is somebody who's not written it really before is one of the questions I have is how much is subtlety part of magical realism? Like how subtle do the otherworldly slash magical elements have to be, or is there another way? How I guess my first question is how would you define magical realism? And I know one or both of you have mentioned that you've written what could fall under that category before. So yeah, how do you define magical realism? Because even growing up, I was taught in my English classes in high school, we had to read magical realism, but my teachers never really defined it. So I'm just curious how you guys would define it. And for our Vela authors out there who have seen the term or maybe seen the tag out there who are wondering what does that actually mean?
Gail, you want to
It's
go
not
first?
something that I've ever really thought about. Is this how I would define what I'm writing? So I would like to hear what you consider magical realism. I mean, isn't anything set in a real contemporary world that has magical elements? Is that magical realism?
That's sort of the boilerplate definition I've gotten.
Uh-huh.
Is right, something set in the normal world with some magical elements to it.
Then yes,
Um,
well, you write a lot of it.
But you could easily
well,
say that's contemporary fantasy or urban fantasy or what have you.
Uh-huh. Exactly. Exactly. Uh-huh.
My interpretation of it was always that um, if science fiction is the literature of the improbable and fantasy is the literature of the impossible, magical realism is the literature of the impossible where nothing is explained. So if Charles DeLint is writing an urban, because he's like the urban fantasy guy, right?
yeah,
Most of us recognize him when we mention the term. Charles DeLint writes as something set in Toronto or whatever, and this woman is being stalked by like the Green Man, you know, or Leshy from like Russian mythology. So there's like a basis for the character in mythology or in folklore or whatever, and then they're incorporating it into a modern setting. So that's urban or contemporary fantasy. But then you have a story like where um, I'll give you an example from what I'm working on right now. Basically, there's a chair that sits in a house, and that chair can be used to summon the spirit of like a dead mother. Only when the mother arrives in this world, all she does is like bitch at her son. So there's nothing in folklore about that kind of thing, and there's no rules. I don't discuss any of the rules. So traditionally, if I'm writing for magazines, no one's calling that magical realism. Everyone's calling that like weird tales because that's the term we had set up back in the pulp era. But if I'm writing that and I'm setting it like if I'm writing it in the 1990s, especially, somebody will eventually call it magical realism there's nothing being explained and there's nothing in folklore or mythology to fall back on. So in other words, it's not being explained. Like with the very old man with enormous wings. That's the one we all read in college, right? And that's Marquez, and that's like he's
yes,
like
oh yeah,
he's like the very definition of magical realism for most of us.
yeah.
Nobody explains the old man, and then one day he flies away, right? And so there's it's all inexplicable.
Mm.
That's magical realism. It's fantasy that is not being codified and structured and explained for people.
I
That's my
love that.
definition of it.
I love that definition. I really do because one of one of my maybe misconceptions is I thought that magical realism had to be very subtle because I guess in some of the stories I read, it kind of just played a subtle role. Like you might have, say, a certain object that has weird properties or that causes weird things to happen. Um, but it wasn't necessarily at the center of the story. And so I like that you pointed some of those examples, I think make it
Hmm.
clear that magical realism can be pretty explicit and still have that same category.
Well, to me, it's the reason why I don't try to put a label on anything I write. So, because to me, there's two different things. Like I said, there's science fiction, which is, it should some way your fictions in some way and reflect scientific theories and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then there's fantasy, where you can write pretty much whatever you want to, because all you got to do is just say, well, magic. So it's impossible stuff. Even what we would consider miracles would be considered magic, because it's just being willed into existence. It's just appearing. There's nothing there. There's no reason. There's no logical reason why it should be here. So you've got science fiction and you've got fantasy, and that's where I stop with mine. I only add other subgenres to it for other people, because it really seems like it's difficult for people nowadays if you don't help them pigeonhole something. And I get very frustrated with that, which is why I don't do a whole lot of talking to people about, unless they're in the industry and they kind of already know a lot of the terms, because people just start. That's what the whole punk proliferation thing is in science fiction. It's everybody, trying to come up with their own little punk thing, solar punk, hat punk, technical writer punk, or whatever the heck it is. They've just blown apart science fiction as a concept, and they've got all these little tiny niches. And I mean, that's to me, it's destructive, because just going from like a nice big blanket term allows us to write whatever we want to.
Right.
But niching it down like that, I can't speak for everybody, but it crushes and kills my creativity. Because if I'm having to sit there and think about the stories I'm writing, like, oh God, is this blanket punk? And then I have to go on the computer, and I have to look at like 46 definitions written by 46 girls named Jennifer on what they feel like blanket punk should be. And I'm sitting there trying to, because I'm trying to sell the short story to an anthology. I'm thinking more about the definition of the genre thing that I'm trying to write in than I am about the actual story itself. And because I'm worried about getting busted. I'm worried about getting that snotty rejection letter that says, this isn't even blanket punk. Do you even lift? That kind of thing.
And that strangles for creativity.
It does.
And
it just, oh yeah.
Magical realism, is Jim Butcher magical realism? I mean, he's a wizard.
I think of him as urban fantasy.
Yeah, because again, because they talk about the rules.
Where do we draw the line? What about Ramsey Campbell and some of his horror? I mean, the Manitou and the doll that ate its mother.
I don't even consider a lot of Campbell stuff horror. I do consider it more fantasy, dark, like a darker. But here we go again. What's horror and what's dark fantasy? We splintered that thing in the late 90s, and no one can tell me what's the difference between horror and dark fantasy.
And urban fantasy.
And urban fantasy, because you could say a lot of Charles DeLint falls into horror rather than fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think subdividing the subdivisions is not beneficial for writers.
Yeah. I don't think it is at all. I think it stifles creativity.
And even the old pulp magazines, you would have weird tales in some of the detective magazines, and you would have mysteries in some of the weird magazines,
right.
And yet the readers didn't care. So I just know I don't like the subdividing the subdivisions. It's stressful and it's irritating, and it doesn't really mean anything in the end, except to give people who don't know what they're writing something to argue about.
Right. And isn't that really the most important thing in science fiction? It's just an endless argument about nothing.
Apparently.
Yeah. I would think that's the definition of science fiction. A bunch of fat ball guys that look like me sitting around saying the words unsustainable and fair enough over and over again as they argue about everything under the sun. That's what I think science fiction is now.
Are there maybe there are some of those subgenres are pretty useful though too, like cozy mystery might be one that's fairly useful, fairly easy to define,
Mhm.
and fairly helpful for both
I think
readers
it's
and
easier
writers.
in mystery to subdivide. I really do. Than into something like fantasy and horror and dark
Yeah.
fantasy, everything.
I agree. I think mystery is a good one. I think a lot of the I don't know that there's I don't know if it's like a subgenre, but I think a lot of the words, the terminology used in romance is really helpful too. When
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
somebody
like
says meet cute,
Regency,
you know exactly what
Regency
you're getting in
romance.
a meet cute. Yeah.
Yeah, or
Regency,
Regency
Regency.
romance.
Regency, oh man, I immediately like
Uh,
hear the theme song to Bridgerton
yeah.
when I think Regency now. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, that's
what's
interesting how it's like sci-fi fantasy is where subgenres kind of have been more maybe destructive.
Mm,
Interesting way to think of it.
mm-hmm.
Well, we've been trying to self-destruct for the last 70 years. We just kicked it into overdrive since like the millennium.
Yep. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Because
What?
I mean, if you think about the separation between the people who are coming to science fiction and fantasy from television, and I'm not knocking them. There's a lot of kids. That's how that's and you know what? If they're picking up a book because of something they saw on TV,
Yes.
I could weep with joy. So don't
Yes.
think for a second I'm down and I'm going down. I mean, I'm like busting these kids. If they're doing that, that's wonderful. But if you think about the insular, tight knit, nobody gets in kind of thing that like the core of science fiction, the old guard, who are like have a stranglehold on the awards and on whatnot. And you think about these kids way over here that are reading nothing but like just one book after another about uh, wizard schools and vampires and werewolves and demon fighters and all that stuff. Then they're like not even close, but it's still the same genre.
Yeah.
But they're like universes apart in
Yeah.
terms. And I don't even know that they even communicate with each other. I don't even really consider it a community anymore.
Or it's two communities.
It is, right? And I would, and boy, as much as I hate to say this, I would rather write for those kids
Yes.
who are reading nothing but vampires and stuff like that because their tastes are going to change eventually.
Yeah.
And it seems to me they're going to keep a more open mind, and they're also younger. They're not dying from complications due to diabetes and whatnot, like the graybeards are. So I mean, I would rather write for them anyway because it seems like they have a greater passion and energy for it. And it seems like this old guard over here just seems more interested in um, like keeping a stranglehold on something that doesn't even exist. It's like watching the emperor in the Dark Crystal just crumble from like whatever disease is killing him, and he's like holding onto the scepter as he's like dying. That's what the science fiction and fantasy community seem like to me sometimes now.
They just embrace nitpickery and not really thinking about the actual writing and the ideas.
Yeah.
And that's sad because I don't know, did it when they kind of got out of the ghetto and of science fiction and started being more mainstream, I think that was bad for them.
You think so?
I think it was bad for those kind of writers who said, "Oh, look, we're mainstream now. Now we can start getting all literary and talking about this, that, and the other."
Yeah.
Instead of just writing their 70,000 words paperbacks from the 70s and everything and just collecting their $1,000 and moving on.
Right.
And now they've got taken themselves very seriously, and I'm not sure that that's always a good idea.
See, that's interesting to me because that suggests the only way we can thrive is to go back to the ghetto. And I'm all for that.
Tell me
I
about
I I, I don't really. I mean, I try to read some new stuff, especially when the two of you recommend it.
it. Uh-huh.
I'm on the lookout right now for 13th Night right now
Oh,
because
good.
you mentioned it the other day.
You're gonna like
Um,
that.
yeah, I mean, I'm always on the lookout for a new writer and new books and everything, and obviously I'm reading new stuff on Vella all the time.
Yep.
But I mean, when I'm thinking of a story, I'm thinking of how it would have been written back like in the 50s through the 70s.
Yes, me too.
And and like what you're talking about, 60 to 75,000 words, and I'm
Uh-huh.
done.
Yep.
I
Uh-huh.
walk away from it. I'd prefer to not write a sequel. right? Because I mean, most of the stuff was standalone books back then.
Yeah.
You know, I understand that that's where the money is, and I have 3 series that I do. I do a mystery, I do a science fiction, and I've got a fantasy about to start releasing.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I'm willing to do the series, but I would much prefer those, 70,000 word
Yeah. Uh-huh. You tell the
exciting thought
story.
exercises. Yeah, it's like I'm putting a lot of thought and scientific principle and all that into the book, but I'm also blowing crap up, and
Yeah.
and aliens are like dripping with slime, and it's awesome, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
guys, yeah, I think you covered this really well with magical realism, and then I know we kind of went even further into how other genres deal
Yeah,
with
I don't even know what you're going to call this video.
Yeah.
But well, I think I'll call it discussing magical realism and then subgenres in general across various genres and how that's affected science fiction fantasy too, especially.
Love it.
You could
So,
call it that. It could be more. You could be more
Sure.
succinct and say that Gail and Lewis like choked to death on their own venom.
there's that too.
That
That'll be the
works too.
subtitle. That's
That
why
works.
we have subtitles. All right.
Yeah.